Chapter 29, Preparations for Escape. I hardly expect that the reader will credit me when I affirm that I lived in that little dismal hole, almost deprived of light and air, with no space to move my limbs, for nearly 7 years. But it is a fact, and to me a sad one even now, for my body still suffers from the effects of that long imprisonment, to say nothing of my soul. Members of my family, now living in New York and Boston, can testify to the truth of what I say. Countless were the nights that I sat late at the little loophole, scarcely large enough to give me a glimpse of one twinkling star. There I heard the patrols and slave hunters conferring together about the capture of runaways, well knowing how rejoiced they would be to catch me. Season after season, year after year, I peeped at my children's faces and heard their sweet voices, with a heart yearning all the while to say, "Your mother is here." Sometimes it appeared to me as if ages had rolled away since I entered upon that gloomy, monotonous existence. At times I was stupefied and listless. At other times I became very impatient to know when these dark years would end, and I should again be allowed to feel the sunshine and breathe the pure air. After Ellen left us, this feeling increased. Mr. Sands had agreed that Benny might go to the north whenever his Uncle Philip could go with him, and I was anxious to be there also, to watch over my children and protect them so far as I was able. Moreover, I was likely to be drowned out of my den if I remained much longer, for the slight roof was getting badly out of repair, and Uncle Philip was afraid to remove the shingles, lest someone should get a glimpse of me. When storms occurred in the night, they spread mats and bits of carpet, which in the morning appeared to have been laid out to dry, but to cover the roof in the daytime might have attracted attention. Consequently, my clothes and bedding were often drenched, a process by which the pains and aches in my cramped and stiffened limbs were greatly increased. I revolved various plans of escape in my mind, which I sometimes imparted to my grandmother when she came to whisper with me at the trapdoor. The kind-hearted old woman had an intense sympathy for runaways. She had known too much of the cruelties inflicted on those who were captured. Her memory always flew back at once to the sufferings of her bright and handsome son, Benjamin, the youngest and dearest of her flock. So whenever I alluded to the subject, she would groan out, "Oh, don't think of it, child, you'll break my heart." I had no good old Aunt Nancy now to encourage me, but my brother William and my children were continually beckoning me to the north. And now I must go back a few months in my story. I have stated that the 1st of January was the time for selling slaves, or leasing them out to new masters. If time were counted by heart-throbs, the poor slaves might reckon years of suffering during that festival so joyous to the free. On the New Year's Day preceding my aunt's death, one of my friends, named Fanny, was to be sold at auction to pay her master's debts. My thoughts were with her during all the day, and at night I anxiously inquired what had been her fate. I was told that she had been sold to one master and her 4 little girls to another master, far distant, that she'd escaped from her purchaser, and was not to be found. Her mother was the old Aggie I have spoken of. She lived in a small tenement belonging to my grandmother and built on the same lot with her own house. Her dwelling was searched and watched, and that brought the patrols so near me that I was obliged to keep very close in my den. The hunters were somehow eluded, and not long afterwards, Benny accidentally caught sight of Fanny in her mother's hut. He told his grandmother, who charged him never to speak of it, explaining to him the frightful consequences, and he never betrayed the trust. Aggie little dreamed that my grandmother knew where her daughter was concealed, and that the stooping form of her old neighbor was bending under a similar burden of anxiety and fear. But these dangerous secrets deepened the sympathy between the 2 old persecuted mothers. My friend Fanny and I remained many weeks hidden within call of each other, but she was unconscious of the fact. I longed to have her share my den, which seemed a more secure retreat than her own, But I had brought so much trouble on my grandmother that it seemed wrong to ask her to incur greater risks. My restlessness increased. I had lived too long in bodily pain and anguish of spirit. Always I was in dread that by some accident or some contrivance, slavery would succeed in snatching my children from me. This thought drove me nearly frantic, and I determined to steer for the North Star at all hazards. At this crisis, Providence opened an unexpected way for me to escape. My friend Peter came one evening and asked to speak with me. "Your day has come, Linda," said he. "I have found a chance for you to go to the Free States. You have a fortnight to decide." The news seemed too good to be true, but Peter explained his arrangements and told me all that was necessary was for me to say I would go. I was going to answer him with a joyful yes when the thought of Benny came to my mind. I told him the temptation was exceedingly strong, but I was terribly afraid of Dr. Flint's alleged power over my child, and that I could not go and leave him behind. Peter remonstrated earnestly. He said such a good chance might never occur again, that Benny was free and could be sent to me, and that for the sake of my children's welfare I ought not to hesitate a moment. I told him I would consult with Uncle Philip. My uncle rejoiced in the plan and bade me go by all means. He promised, if his life was spared, that he would either bring or send my son to me as soon as I reached a place of safety. I resolved to go, but thought nothing had better be said to my grandmother till very near the time of departure. But my uncle thought she would feel it more keenly if I left here so suddenly. "I will reason with her," said he, "and convince her how necessary it is, not only for your sake, but for hers also. You cannot be blind to the fact that she is sinking under her burdens." I was not blind to it. I knew that my concealment was an ever-present source of anxiety, and that the older she grew, the more nervously fearful she was of discovery. My uncle talked with her and finally succeeded in persuading her that it was absolutely necessary for me to seize the chance so unexpectedly offered. The anticipation of being a free woman proved almost too much for my weak frame. The excitement stimulated me and at the same time bewildered me. I made busy preparations for my journey and for my son to follow me. I resolved to have an interview with him before I went, that I might give him cautions and advice and tell him how anxiously I should be waiting for him at the North. Grandmother stole up to me as often as possible to whisper words of counsel. She insisted upon my writing to Dr. Flint as soon as I arrived in the Free States and asking him to sell me to her. She insisted upon my writing to Dr. Flint as soon as I arrived in the Free States and asking him to sell me to her. She said she would sacrifice her house and all she had in the world for the sake of having me safe with my children in any part of the world. If she could only live to know that she could die in peace. I promised the dear old faithful friend that I would write to her as soon as I arrived and put the letter in a safe way to reach her. But in my own mind I resolved that not another cent of her hard earnings should be spent to pay rapacious slaveholders for what they called their property. And even if I had not been unwilling to buy what I had already a right to possess, common humanity would have prevented me from accepting the generous offer at the expense of turning my aged relative out of house and home when she was trembling on the brink of the grave. I was to escape in a vessel, but I forbear to mention any further particulars. I was in readiness, but the vessel was unexpectedly detained for several days. Meantime, news came to town of a most horrible murder committed on a fugitive slave named James. Charity, the mother of this unfortunate young man, had been an old acquaintance of ours. I have told the shocking particulars of his death in my description of some of the neighboring slaveholders. My grandmother, always nervously sensitive about runaways, was terribly frightened. She felt sure that a similar fate awaited me if I did not desist from my enterprise. She sobbed and groaned and entreated me not to go. Her excessive fear was somewhat contagious, and my heart was not proof against her extreme agony. I was grievously disappointed, but I promised to relinquish my project. When my friend Peter was apprised of this, he was both disappointed and vexed. He said that, judging from our past experience, it would be a long time before I had such another chance to throw away. I told him it need not be thrown away, that I had a friend concealed nearby who would be glad enough to take the place that had been provided for me. I told him about poor Fanny and the kind-hearted, noble fellow who never turned his back upon anybody in distress, white or black, expressed his readiness to help her. Aggie was much surprised when she found that we knew her secret. She was rejoiced to hear of such a chance for Fanny, and arrangements were made for her to go out on board the vessel the next night. They both supposed that I had long been at the North, therefore my name was not mentioned in the transaction. Fanny was carried on board at the appointed time and stowed away in a very small cabin. This accommodation had been purchased at a price that would pay for a voyage to England. But when one proposes to go to fine old England, they stop to calculate whether they can afford the cost of the pleasure. While in making a bargain to escape from slavery, the trembling victim is ready to say, "Take all I have, only don't betray me." The next morning I peeped through my loophole and saw that it was dark and cloudy. At night I received news that the wind was ahead, and the vessel had not sailed. I was exceedingly anxious about Fanny, and Peter too, who was running a tremendous risk at my instigation. Next day the wind and weather remained the same. Poor Fanny had been half dead with fright when they carried her on board, and I could readily imagine how she must be suffering now. Grandmother came often to my den to say how thankful she was I did not go. On the third morning she rapped for me to come down to the storeroom. The poor old sufferer was breaking down under her weight of trouble. She was easily flurried now. I found her in a nervous, excited state, but I was not aware that she'd forgotten to lock the door behind her, as usual. She was exceedingly worried about the detention of the vessel. She was afraid all would be discovered, and then Fanny and Peter and I would all be tortured to death, and Philip would be utterly ruined, and her house would be torn down. Poor Peter! If he should die such a horrible death as the poor slave James had lately done, and all for his kindness in trying to help me, how dreadful it would be for us all. Alas, the thought was familiar to me and had sent many a sharp pang through my heart. I tried to suppress my own anxiety and speak soothingly to her. She brought in some allusion to Aunt Nancy, the dear daughter she had recently buried, and then she lost all control of herself. As she stood there, trembling and sobbing, a voice from the piazza called out, "Where is you, Aunt Marthy?" Grandmother was startled and in her agitation opened the door without thinking of me. In stepped Jenny, the mischievous housemaid who had tried to enter my room when I was concealed in the house of my white benefactress. "I's been hunting everywhere for you, Aunt Marthy," said she. "My missus wants you to send her some crackers." I had slunk down behind a barrel, which entirely screened me, but I imagined that Jenny was looking directly at the spot, and my heart beat violently. My grandmother immediately thought what she had done, and went out quickly with Jenny to count the crackers, locking the door after her. She returned to me in a few minutes, the perfect picture of despair. "Poor child," she exclaimed. "My carelessness has ruined you. The bone ain't gone yet. Get ready immediately and go with Fanny. I ain't got another word to say against it now, for there's no telling what may happen this day." Uncle Philip was sent for, and he agreed with his mother in thinking that Jenny would inform Dr. Flint in less than 24 hours. He advised getting me on board the boat, if possible. If not, I had better keep very still in my den where they could not find me without tearing the house down. He said it would not do for him to move in the matter, because suspicion would be immediately excited, but he promised to communicate with Peter. I felt reluctant to apply to him again, having implicated him too much already, but there seemed to be no alternative. Vexed as Peter had been by my indecision, he was true to his generous nature and said at once that he would do his best to help me, trusting I should show myself a stronger woman this time. He immediately proceeded to the wharf and found that the wind had shifted and the vessel was slowly beating downstream. On some pretext of urgent necessity, he offered 2 boatmen $1 apiece to catch up with her. He was of lighter complexion than the boatmen he hired, and when the captain saw them coming so rapidly, he thought officers were pursuing his vessel in search of the runaway slave he had on board. They hoisted sails, but the boat gained upon them, and the indefatigable Peter sprang on board. The captain at once recognized him. Peter asked him to go below to speak about a bad bill he had given him. When he told his errand, the captain replied, "Why, the woman's here already, and I've put her where you or the devil would have a tough job to find her." "But it is another woman I want to bring," said Peter. "She is in great distress too, and you shall be paid anything within reason if you'll stop and take her." "What's her name?" inquired the captain. "Linda," he replied. "That's the name of the woman already here," rejoined the captain. "By George, I believe you mean to betray me." "Oh," exclaimed Peter, "God knows I wouldn't harm a hair of your head. I am too grateful to you. But there really is another woman in great danger. Do you have the humanity to stop and take her?" After a while, they came to an understanding. Fanny, not dreaming I was anywhere about in that region, had assumed my name, though she called herself Johnson. "Linda is a common name," said Peter, "and the woman I want to bring is Linda Brent." The captain agreed to wait at a certain place till evening, being handsomely paid for his detention. Of course, the day was an anxious one for us all, but we concluded that if Jenny had seen me, she would be too wise to let her mistress know of it, and that she probably would not get a chance to see Dr. Flint's family till evening, for I knew very well what were the rules in that household. I afterwards believed that she did not see me, for nothing ever came of it, and she was one of those base characters that would have jumped to betray a suffering fellow being for the sake of 30 pieces of silver. I made all the arrangements to go on board as soon as it was dusk. The intervening time I resolved to spend with my son. I had not spoken to him for several years, though I had been under the same roof and seen him every day when I was well enough to sit at the loophole. I did not dare to venture beyond the storeroom. So they brought him there and locked us up together in a place concealed from the piazza door. It was an agitating interview for both of us. After we had talked and wept together for a little while, he said, "Mother, I'm glad you're going away. I wish I could go with you. I knew you was here. And I've been so afraid they would come and catch you." I was greatly surprised and asked him how he had found it out. He replied, "I was standing under the eaves one day before Ellen went away, and I heard somebody cough up over the woodshed. I don't know what made me think it was you, but I did think so. I missed Ellen the night before she went away, and Grandmother brought her back into the room in the night, and I thought maybe she'd been to see you before she went, for I heard Grandmother whisper to her, 'Now go to sleep and remember never to tell.'" I asked him if he ever mentioned his suspicions to his sister. He said he never did, but after he heard the cough, if he saw her playing with other children on that side of the house, he always tried to coax her round to the other side, for fear they would hear me cough too. He said he had kept a close lookout for Dr. Flint, and if he saw him speak to a constable or a patrol, he always told Grandmother. I now recollected that I'd seen him manifest uneasiness when people were on that side of the house, and I had at the time been puzzled to conjecture a motive for his actions. Such prudence may seem extraordinary in a boy of 12 years, but slaves being surrounded by mysteries, deceptions, and dangers, early learn to be suspicious and watchful, and prematurely cautious and cunning. He had never asked a question of Grandmother or Uncle Philip, and I had often heard him chime in with other children when they spoke of my being at the North. I told him I was now really going to the Free States, and if he was a good, honest boy and a loving child to his dear old grandmother, the Lord would bless him and bring him to me, and we and Ellen would live together. He began to tell me that Grandmother had not eaten anything all day. While he was speaking, the door was unlocked, and she came in with a small bag of money which she wanted me to take. I begged her to keep a part of it, at least, to pay for Benny's being sent to the North, but she insisted, while her tears were falling fast, that I should take the whole. "You may be sick among strangers," she said, "and they would send you to the poorhouse to die." Ah, that good Grandmother. For the last time I went up to my nook. Its desolate appearance no longer chilled me, for the light of hope had risen in my soul. Yet, even with the blessed prospect of freedom before me, I felt very sad at leaving forever that old homestead where I had been sheltered so long by the dear old grandmother, where I had dreamed my first young dream of love, and where, after that had faded away, my children came to twine themselves so closely round my desolate heart. As the hour approached for me to leave, I again descended to the storeroom. My grandmother and Benny were there. She took me by the hand and said, "Linda, let us pray." We knelt down together, with my child pressed to my heart, and my other arm round the faithful, loving old friend I was about to leave forever. On no other occasion has it ever been my lot to listen to so fervent a supplication for mercy and protection. It thrilled through my heart and inspired me with trust in God. Peter was waiting for me in the street. I was soon by his side, faint in body but strong of purpose. I did not look back upon the old place, though I felt that I should never see it again. Chapter 30, Northward Bound. I never could tell how we reached the wharf. My brain was all of a whirl, and my limbs tottered under me. At an appointed place, we met my Uncle Philip, who had started before us on a different route, that he might reach the wharf first and give us timely warning if there was any danger. A rowboat was in readiness. As I was about to step in, I felt something pull me gently, and turning round, I saw Benny, looking pale and anxious. He whispered in my ear, "I've been peeping into the doctor's window, and he's at home. Goodbye, Mother. Don't cry. I'll come." He hastened away. I clasped the hand of my good uncle to whom I owed so much, and of Peter, the brave, generous friend who had volunteered to run such terrible risks to secure my safety. To this day I remember how his bright face beamed with joy when he told me he had discovered a safe method for me to escape. Yet that intelligent, enterprising, noble-hearted man was a chattel, liable by the laws of a country that calls itself civilized to be sold with horses and pigs. We parted in silence. Our hearts were all too full for words. Swiftly the boat glided over the water. After a while, one of the sailors said, "Don't be downhearted, madam. We will take you safely to your husband in..." At first I could not imagine what he meant, but I had presence of mind to think that it probably referred to something the captain had told him. So I thanked him and said I hoped we should have pleasant weather. When I entered the vessel, the captain came forward to meet me. He was an elderly man with a pleasant countenance. He showed me to a little box of a cabin where sat my friend Fanny. She started as if she had seen a specter. She gazed on me in utter astonishment and exclaimed, "Linda, can this be you? Or is it your ghost?" When we were locked in each other's arms, my overwrought feelings could no longer be restrained. My sobs reached the ears of the captain, who came and very kindly reminded us that for his safety as well as our own, it would be prudent for us not to attract any attention. He said that when there was a sail in sight, he wished us to keep below, but at other times he had no objection to our being on deck. He assured us that he would keep a good lookout, and if we acted prudently, he thought we should be in no danger. He had represented us as women going to meet our husbands in... We thanked him and promised to observe carefully all the directions he gave us. Fanny and I now talked by ourselves, lowly and quietly, in our little cabin. She told me of the sufferings she had gone through in making her escape, and of her terrors while she was concealed in her mother's house. Above all, she dwelt on the agony of separation from all her children on that dreadful auction day. She could scarcely credit me when I told her of the place where I had passed nearly 7 years. "We have the same sorrows," said I. "No," replied she. "You are going to see your children soon, and there's no hope that I shall ever hear from mine." The vessel was soon under way, but we made slow progress. The wind was against us. I should not have cared for this if we had been out of sight of the town, but until there were miles of water between us and our enemies, we were filled with constant apprehensions that the constables would come on board. Neither could I feel quite at ease with the captain and his men. I was an entire stranger to that class of people, and I had heard that sailors were rough and sometimes cruel. We were so completely in their power that if they were bad men, our situation would be dreadful. Now that the captain was paid for our passage, might he not be tempted to make more money by giving us up to those who claimed us as property? I was naturally of a confiding disposition, but slavery had made me suspicious of everybody. Fanny did not share my distrust of the captain or his men. She said she was afraid at first, but she had been on board 3 days while the vessel lay in the dock, and nobody had betrayed her or treated her otherwise than kindly. The captain soon came to advise us to go on deck for fresh air. His friendly, respectful manner, combined with Fanny's testimony, reassured me, and we went with him. He placed us in a comfortable seat and occasionally entered into conversation. He told us he was a Southerner by birth and had spent the greater part of his life in the slave states, and that he had recently lost a brother who traded in slaves. "But," said he, "it is a pitiable and degrading business, and I always felt ashamed to acknowledge my brother in connection with it." As we passed Snaky Swamp, he pointed to it and said, "There is a slave territory that defies all the laws." I thought of the terrible days I had spent there, and though it was not called Dismal Swamp, it made me feel very dismal as I looked at it. I shall never forget that night. The balmy air of spring was so refreshing. And how shall I describe my sensations when we were fairly sailing on Chesapeake Bay? Oh, the beautiful sunshine, the exhilarating breeze, and I could enjoy them without fear or restraint. I had never realized what grand things air and sunlight are till I had been deprived of them. 10 days after we left land, we were approaching Philadelphia. The captain said we should arrive there in the night, but he thought we had better wait till morning and go on shore in broad daylight as the best way to avoid suspicion. I replied, "You know best, but will you stay on board and protect us?" He saw that I was suspicious, and he said he was sorry, now that he had brought us to the end of our voyage, to find I had so little confidence in him. Ah, if he had ever been a slave, he would have known how difficult it was to trust a white man. He assured us that we might sleep through the night without fear, that he would take care we were not left unprotected. Be it said to the honor of this captain, Southerner as he was, that if Fanny and I had been white ladies and our passage lawfully engaged, he could not have treated us more respectfully. My intelligent friend Peter had rightly estimated the character of the man to whose honor he had entrusted us. The next morning I was on deck as soon as the day dawned. I called Fanny to see the sunrise for the first time in our lives on free soil. For such I then believed it to be. We watched the reddening sky and saw the great orb come up slowly out of the water as it seemed. Soon the waves began to sparkle and everything caught the beautiful glow. Before us lay the city of strangers. We looked at each other and the eyes of both were moistened with tears. We had escaped from slavery, and we supposed ourselves to be safe from the hunters. But we were alone in the world, and we had left dear ties behind us, ties cruelly sundered by the demon slavery. Chapter 31. Incidents in Philadelphia. I had heard that the poor slave had many friends at the North. I trusted we should find some of them. Meantime, we would take it for granted that all were friends till they proved to the contrary. I sought out the kind captain, thanked him for his attentions, and told him I should never cease to be grateful for the service he had rendered us. I gave him a message to the friends I had left at home, and he promised to deliver it. We were placed in a rowboat, and in about 15 minutes were landed on a wood wharf in Philadelphia. As I stood looking round, the friendly captain touched me on the shoulder and said, "There is a respectable-looking colored man behind you. I will speak to him about the New York trains and tell him you wish to go directly on." I thanked him and asked him to direct me to some shops where I could buy gloves and veils. He did so and said he would talk with the colored man till I returned. I made what haste I could, Constant exercise on board the vessel and frequent rubbing with salt water had nearly restored the use of my limbs. The noise of the great city confused me, but I found the shops and bought some double veils and gloves for Fanny and myself. The shopman told me they were so many levies. I had never heard the word before, but I did not tell him so. I thought if he knew I was a stranger, he might ask me where I came from. I gave him a gold piece, and when he returned the change, I counted it and found out how much a levy was. I made my way back to the wharf, where the captain introduced me to the colored man as the Reverend Jeremiah Durham, minister of Bethel Church. He took me by the hand as if I had been an old friend. He told us we were too late for the morning cars to New York and must wait until the evening or the next morning. He invited me to go home with him, assuring me that his wife would give me a cordial welcome, and for my friend he would provide a home with one of his neighbors. I thanked him for so much kindness to strangers and told him if I must be detained, I should like to hunt up some people who formerly went from our part of the country. Mr. Durham insisted that I should dine with him, and then he would assist me in finding my friends. The sailors came to bid us goodbye. I shook their hearty hands with tears in my eyes. They had all been kind to us, and they had rendered us a greater service than they could possibly conceive of. I had never seen so large a city or been in contact with so many people in the streets. It seemed as if those who passed looked at us with an expression of curiosity. My face was so blistered and peeled by sitting on deck in wind and sunshine that I thought they could not easily decide to what nation I belonged. Mrs. Durham met me with a kindly welcome without asking any questions. I was tired, and her friendly manner was a sweet refreshment. God bless her! I was sure that she had comforted other weary hearts before I received her sympathy. She was surrounded by her husband and children in a home made sacred by protecting laws. I thought of my own children and sighed. After dinner, Mr. Durham went with me in quest of the friends I had spoken of. They went from my native town, and I anticipated much pleasure in looking on familiar faces. They were not at home, and we retraced our steps through streets delightfully clean. On the way, Mr. Durham observed that I had spoken to him of a daughter I expected to meet, that he was surprised, for I looked so young he had taken me for a single woman. He was approaching a subject on which I was extremely sensitive. He would ask about my husband next, I thought, and if I answered him truly, what would he think of me? I told him I had 2 children, one in New York, the other at the South. He asked some further questions, and I frankly told him some of the most important events of my life. It was painful for me to do it, but I would not deceive him. If he was desirous of being my friend, I thought he ought to know how far I was worthy of it. "Excuse me if I have tried your feelings," said he. "I did not question you from idle curiosity. I wanted to understand your situation, in order to know whether I could be of any service to you or your little girl. Your straightforward answers do you credit, but don't answer everybody so openly. It might give some heartless people a pretext for treating you with contempt." That word, contempt, burned me like coals of fire. I replied, "God alone knows how I have suffered, and He, I trust, will forgive me if I am permitted to have my children. I intend to be a good mother and to live in such a manner that people cannot treat me with contempt." "I respect your sentiments," said he. "Place your trust in God and be governed by good principles, and you will not fail to find friends." When we reached home, I went to my room, glad to shut out the world for a while. The words he had spoken made an indelible impression upon me. They brought up great shadows from the mournful past. In the midst of my meditations, I was startled by a knock at the door. Mrs. Durham entered, her face all beaming with kindness, to say that there was an anti-slavery friend downstairs who would like to see me. I overcame my dread of encountering strangers and went with her. Many questions were asked concerning my experiences and my escape from slavery, but I observed how careful they all were not to say anything that might wound my feelings. How gratifying this was can be fully understood only by those who have been accustomed to be treated as if they were not included within the pale of human beings. The anti-slavery friend had come to inquire into my plans and to offer assistance if needed. Fanny was comfortably established for the present with a friend of Mr. Durham. The Anti-Slavery Society agreed to pay her expenses to New York. The same was offered to me, but I declined to accept it, telling them that my grandmother had given me sufficient to pay my expenses to the end of my journey. We were urged to remain in Philadelphia a few days until some suitable escort could be found for us. I gladly accepted the proposition, for I had a dread of meeting slaveholders and some dread also of railroads. I had never entered a railroad car in my life, and it seemed to me quite an important event. That night, I sought my pillow with feelings I had never carried to it before. I verily believed myself to be a free woman. I was wakeful for a long time, and I had no sooner fallen asleep than I was roused by fire bells. I jumped up and hurried on my clothes. Where I came from, everybody hastened to dress themselves on such occasions. The white people thought a great fire might be used as a good opportunity for insurrection, and that it was best to be in readiness, and the colored people were ordered out to labor in extinguishing the flames. There was but one engine in our town, and colored women and children were often required to drag it to the river's edge and fill it. Mrs. Durham's daughter slept in the same room with me, and seeing that she slept through all the din, I thought it was my duty to wake her. "What's the matter?" said she, rubbing her eyes. "They're screaming fire in the streets and bells are ringing," I replied. "What of that?" said she, drowsily. "We're used to it. We never get up without the fire is very near. What good would it do?" I was quite surprised that it was not necessary for us to go and help fill the engine. I was an ignorant child, just beginning to learn how things went on in great cities. At daylight, I heard women crying fresh fish, berries, radishes, and other various things. All this was new to me. I dressed myself at an early hour and sat at the window to watch that unknown tide of life. Philadelphia seemed to me a wonderfully great place. At the breakfast table, my idea of going out to drag the engine was laughed over, and I joined in the mirth. I went to see Fanny and found her so well contented among her new friends that she was in no haste to leave. I was also very happy with my kind hostess. She had had advantages for education and was vastly my superior. Every day, almost every hour, I was adding to my little stock of knowledge. She took me out to see the city as much as she deemed prudent. One day she took me to an artist's room and showed me the portraits of some of her children. I had never seen any paintings of colored people before, and they seemed to be beautiful. At the end of 5 days, one of Mrs. Durham's friends offered to accompany us to New York the following morning. As I held the hand of my good hostess in a parting clasp, I longed to know whether her husband had repeated to her what I had told him. I supposed he had, but she never made any allusion to it. I presume it was the delicate silence of womanly sympathy. When Mr. Durham handed us our tickets, he said, "I am afraid you will have a disagreeable ride, but I could not procure tickets for the first-class cars." Supposing I had not given him money enough, I offered more. "Oh, no," said he, "they could not be had for any money. They don't allow colored people to go in the first-class cars." This was the first chill to my enthusiasm about the free states. Colored people were allowed to ride in a filthy box behind white people at the South. But there they were not required to pay for the privilege. It made me sad to find how the North aped the customs of slavery. We were stowed away in a large rough car with windows on each side, too high for us to look out without standing up. It was crowded with people, apparently of all nations. There were plenty of beds and cradles containing screaming and kicking babies. Every other man had a cigar or pipe in his mouth, and jugs of whiskey were handed round freely. The fumes of the whiskey and the dense tobacco smoke were sickening to my senses, and my mind was equally nauseated by the coarse jokes and ribald songs around me. It was a very disagreeable ride. Since that time, there has been some improvement in these matters. Chapter 32. The Meeting of Mother and Daughter. When we arrived in New York, I was half crazed by the crowd of coachmen calling out, "Carriage, ma'am?" We bargained with one to take us to Sullivan Street for 12 shillings. A burly Irishman stepped up and said, "I'll take ye for 6 shillings." The reduction of half the price was an object to us, and we asked if he could take us right away. "Troth, and I will, ladies," he replied. I noticed that the hackmen smiled at each other, and I inquired whether his conveyance was decent. "Yes, it's decent it is, marm. Devil a bit would I be after taking ladies in a cab that was not decent." We gave him our checks. He went for the baggage and soon reappeared, saying, "This way, if you please, ladies." We followed and found our trunks on a truck, and we were invited to take our seats on them. We told him that was not what we bargained for, and he must take the trunks off. He swore they should not be touched till we had paid him 6 shillings. In our situation, it was not prudent to attract attention, and I was about to pay him what he required when a man nearby shook his head for me not to do it. After a great ado, we got rid of the Irishman and had our trunks fastened on a hack. We had been recommended to a boarding house in Sullivan Street, and thither we drove. There, Fanny and I separated. The Anti-Slavery Society provided a home for her, and I afterwards heard of her in prosperous circumstances. I sent for an old friend from my part of the country who had for some time been doing business in New York. He came immediately. I told him I wanted to go to my daughter and asked him to aid me in procuring an interview. I cautioned him not to let it be known to the family that I had just arrived from the South because they supposed I had been at the North 7 years. He told me there was a colored woman in Brooklyn who came from the same town I did, and I had better go to her house and have my daughter meet me there. I accepted the proposition thankfully, and he agreed to escort me to Brooklyn. We crossed Fulton Ferry, went up Myrtle Avenue, and stopped at the house he designated. I was just about to enter when 2 girls passed. My friend called my attention to them. I turned and recognized in the eldest Sarah, the daughter of a woman who used to live with my grandmother, but who had left the South years ago. Surprised and rejoiced at this unexpected meeting, I threw my arms around her and inquired concerning her mother. "You take no notice of the other girl," said my friend. I turned, and there stood my Ellen. I pressed her to my heart, then held her away from me to take a look at her. She had changed a good deal in the 2 years since I parted from her. Signs of neglect could be discerned by eyes less observing than a mother's. My friend invited us all to go into the house, but Ellen said she'd been sent of an errand, which she would do as quickly as possible, and go home and ask Mrs. Hobbs to let her come and see me. It was agreed that I should send for her the next day. Her companion, Sarah, hastened to tell her mother of my arrival. When I entered the house, I found the mistress of it absent, and I waited for her return. Before I saw her, I heard her saying, "Where is Linda Brent? I used to know her father and mother." Soon Sarah came with her mother, so there was quite a company of us, all from my grandmother's neighborhood. These friends gathered round me and questioned me eagerly. They laughed, they cried, and they shouted. They thanked God that I had got away from my persecutors and was safe on Long Island. It was a day of great excitement. How different from the silent days I had passed in my dreary den. The next morning was Sunday. My first waking thoughts were occupied with the note I was to send to Mrs. Hobbs, the lady with whom Ellen lived. That I had recently come into that vicinity was evident. Otherwise, I should have sooner inquired for my daughter. It would not do to let them know I had just arrived from the South, for that would involve the suspicious of my having been harbored there, and might bring trouble, if not ruin, on several other people. I like a straightforward course, and am always reluctant to resort to subterfuges. So far as my ways have been crooked, I charge them all upon slavery. It was that system of violence and wrong which now left me no alternative but to enact a falsehood. I began my note by stating that I had recently arrived from Canada and was very desirous to have my daughter come to see me. She came and brought a message from Mrs. Hobbs inviting me to her house and assuring me that I need not have any fears. The conversation I had with my child did not leave my mind at ease. When I asked if she was well treated, she answered yes. But there was no heartiness in the tone, and it seemed to me that she said it from an unwillingness to have me troubled on her account. Before she left me, she asked very earnestly, "Mother, will you take me to live with you?" It made me sad to think that I could not give her a home till I went to work and earned the means, and that might take me a long time. When she was placed with Mrs. Hobbs, the agreement was that she should be sent to school. She had been there 2 years and was now 9 years old. She scarcely knew her letters. There was no excuse for this, for there were good public schools in Brooklyn to which she could have been sent without expense. She stayed with me till dark, and I went home with her. I was received in a friendly manner by the family, and all agreed in saying that Ellen was a useful, good girl. Mrs. Hobbs looked me coolly in the face and said, "I suppose you know that my cousin, Mr. Sands, has given her to my eldest daughter. She will make a nice waiting maid for her when she grows up." I did not answer a word. How could she, who knew by experience the strength of a mother's love and who was perfectly aware of the relation Mr. Sands bore to my children, how could she look at me in the face while she thrust such a dagger into my heart? I was no longer surprised that they had kept her in such a state of ignorance. Mr. Hobbs had formerly been wealthy, but he had failed, and afterwards obtained a subordinate situation in the custom house. Perhaps they expected to return to the South some day, and Ellen's knowledge was quite sufficient for a slave's condition. I was impatient to go to work and earn money, that I might change the uncertain position of my children. Mr. Sands had not kept his promise to emancipate them. I had also been deceived about Ellen. What security had I with regard to Benjamin? I felt that I had none. I returned to my friend's house in an uneasy state of mind. In order to protect my children, it was necessary that I should own myself. I called myself free and sometimes felt so, but I knew I was insecure. I sat down that night and wrote a civil letter to Dr. Flint, asking him to state the lowest terms on which he would sell me. And as I belonged by law to his daughter, I wrote to her also, making a similar request. Since my arrival at the North, I had not been unmindful of my dear brother William. I had made diligent inquiries for him. And having heard of him in Boston, I went thither. When I arrived there, I found he had gone to New Bedford. I wrote to that place and was informed he had gone on a whaling voyage and would not return for some months. I went back to New York to get employment near Ellen. I received an answer from Dr. Flint which gave me no encouragement. He advised me to return and submit myself to my rightful owners, and then any request I might make would be granted. I lent this letter to a friend who lost it. Otherwise, I would present a copy to my readers. Chapter 33, A Home Found. My greatest anxiety now was to obtain employment. My health was greatly improved, though my limbs continued to trouble me with swelling whenever I walked too much. The greatest difficulty in my way was that those who employed strangers required a recommendation. And in my peculiar position, I could, of course, obtain no certificates from the families I had so faithfully served. One day an acquaintance told me of a lady who wanted a nurse for her babe, and I immediately applied for the situation. The lady told me she preferred to have one who had been a mother and accustomed to the care of infants. I told her I had nursed 2 babes of my own. She asked me many questions, but to my great relief, did not require a recommendation from my former employers. She told me she was an Englishwoman, and that was a pleasant circumstance to me because I had heard they had less prejudice against color than Americans entertained. It was agreed that we should try each other for a week. The trial proved satisfactory to both parties, and I was engaged for a month. The Heavenly Father had been most merciful to me in leading me to this place. Mrs. Bruce was a kind and gentle lady and proved a true and sympathizing friend. Before the stipulated month expired, the necessity of passing up and down stairs frequently caused my limbs to swell so painfully that I became unable to perform my duties. Many ladies would have thoughtlessly discharged me, but Mrs. Bruce made arrangements to save me steps and employed a physician to attend upon me. I had not yet told her that I was a fugitive slave. She noticed that I was often sad and kindly inquired the cause. I spoke of being separated from my children and from relatives who were dear to me, but I did not mention the constant feeling of insecurity which oppressed my spirits. I longed for someone to confide it, but I had been so deceived by white people that I had lost all confidence in them. If they spoke kind words to me, I thought it was for some selfish purpose. I had entered this family with the distrustful feelings I had brought with me out of slavery. But ere 6 months had passed, I found that the gentle deportment of Mrs. Bruce and the smiles of her lovely babe were thawing my chilled heart. My narrow mind also began to expand under the influences of her intelligent conversation and the opportunities for reading, which were gladly allowed me whenever I had leisure from my duties. I gradually became more energetic and more cheerful. The old feeling of insecurity, especially with regard to my children, often threw its dark shadow across my sunshine. Mrs. Bruce offered me a home for Ellen, but pleasant as it would have been, I did not dare to accept it for fear of offending the Hobbs family. Their knowledge of my precarious situation placed me in their power, and I felt that it was important for me to keep on the right side of them till, by dint of labor and economy, I could make a home for my children. I was far from feeling satisfied with Ellen's situation. She was not well cared for. She sometimes came to New York to visit me, but she generally brought a request from Mrs. Hobbs that I would buy her a pair of shoes or some article of clothing. This was accompanied by a promise of payment when Mr. Hobbs' salary at the custom house became due, but somehow or other the payday never came. Thus many dollars of my earnings were expected to keep my child comfortably clothed. That, however, was a slight trouble compared with the fear that their pecuniary embarrassments might induce them to sell my precious young daughter. I knew they were in constant communication with Southerners and had frequent opportunities to do it. I've stated that when Dr. Flint put Ellen in jail at 2 years old, she had an inflammation of the eyes, occasioned by measles. This disease still troubled her, and kind Mrs. Bruce proposed that she should come to New York for a while, to be under the care of Dr. Elliott, a well-known oculist. It did not occur to me that there was anything improper in a mother's making such a request. But Mrs. Hobbs was very angry and refused to let her go. Situated as I was, it was not politic to insist upon it. I made no complaint, but I longed to be entirely free to act a mother's part towards my children. The next time I went over to Brooklyn, Mrs. Hobbs, as if to apologize for her anger, told me she had employed her own physician to attend to Ellen's eyes, and that she had refused my request because she did not consider it safe to trust her in New York. I accepted the explanation in silence, but she had told me that my child belonged to her daughter, and I suspected that her real motive was a fear of my conveying her property away from her. Perhaps I did her injustice, but my knowledge of Southerners made it difficult for me to feel otherwise. Sweet and bitter were mixed in the cup of my life, and I was thankful that it had ceased to be entirely bitter. I loved Mrs. Bruce's babe. When it laughed and crowed in my face and twined its little tender arms confidingly about my neck, it made me think of the time when Benny and Ellen were babies, and my wounded heart was soothed. One bright morning, as I stood at the window, tossing baby in my arms, my attention was attracted by a young man in sailor's dress who was closely observing every house as he passed. I looked at him earnestly. Could it be my brother William? It must be. And yet, how changed! I placed the baby safely, flew downstairs, opened the front door, beckoned to the sailor, and in less than a minute I was clasped in my brother's arms. How much we had to tell each other, how we laughed and how we cried over each other's adventures. I took him to Brooklyn and again saw him with Ellen, the dear child whom he had loved and tended so carefully, while I was shut up in my miserable den. He stayed in New York a week. His old feelings of affection for me and Ellen were as lively as ever. There are no bonds so strong as those which are formed by suffering together. Chapter 34. The Old Enemy Again. My young mistress, Miss Emily Flint, did not return any answer to my letter requesting her to consent to my being sold, but after a while I received a reply which purported to be written by her younger brother. In order rightly to enjoy the contents of this letter, the reader must bear in mind that the Flint family supposed I had been at the North many years. They had no idea that I knew of the doctor's 3 excursions to New York in search of me, that I had heard his voice when he came to borrow $500 for that purpose, and that I had seen him pass on his way to the steamboat. Neither were they aware that all the particulars of Aunt Nancy's death and burial were conveyed to me at the time they occurred. I have kept the letter, of which I herewith subjoin a copy. Your letter to sister was received a few days ago. I gather from it that you are desirous of returning to your native place among your friends and relatives. We were all gratified with the contents of your letter, and let me assure you that if any members of the family had any feeling of resentment towards you, they feel it no longer. We all sympathize with you in your unfortunate condition and are ready to do all in our power to make you contented and happy. It is difficult for you to return home as a free person. If you were purchased by your grandmother, it is doubtful whether you would be permitted to remain, although it would be lawful for you to do so. If a servant should be allowed to purchase herself after absenting herself so long from her owners and return free, it would have an injurious effect. From your letter, I think your situation must be hard and uncomfortable. Come home. You have it in your power to be reinstated in our affections. We would receive you with open arms and tears of joy. You need not apprehend any unkind treatment, as we have not put ourselves to any trouble or expense to get you. Had we done so, perhaps we should feel otherwise. You know my sister was always attached to you, and that you were never treated as a slave. You were never put to hard work, nor exposed to field labor. On the contrary, you were taken into the house and treated as one of us, and almost as free, and we at least felt that you were above disgracing yourself by running away. Believing you may be induced to come home voluntarily has induced me to write for my sister. The good family will be rejoiced to see you, and your poor old grandmother expressed a great desire to have you come when she heard your letter read. In her old age, she needs the consolation of having her children around her. Doubtless you have heard of the death of your aunt. She was a faithful servant and a faithful member of the Episcopal Church. In her Christian life, she taught us how to live, and, oh, too high the price of knowledge, she taught us how to die. Could you have seen us round her deathbed with her mother, all mingling our tears in one common stream, you would have thought that same heartfelt tie existed between a master and his servant, as between a mother and her child. But this subject is too painful to dwell upon. I must bring my letter to a close. If you are contented to stay away from your old grandmother, your child, and the friends who love you, stay where you are. We shall never trouble ourselves to apprehend you, but should you prefer to come home, we will do all that we can to make you happy. If you do not wish to remain in the family, I know that Father, by our persuasion, will be induced to let you be purchased by any person you may choose in our community. You will please answer this as soon as possible and let us know your decision. Sister sends much love to you. In the meantime, believe me, your sincere friend and well-wisher. This letter was signed by Emily's brother, who was as yet a mere lad. I knew by that style that it was not written by a person of his age, and though the writing was disguised, I had been made too unhappy by it in former years not to recognize at once the hand of Dr. Flint. Oh, the hypocrisy of slaveholders! Did the old fox suppose I was goose enough to go into such a trap? Verily, he relied too much on the stupidity of the African race. I did not return the family of Flints any thanks for their cordial invitation, a remissness for which I was no doubt charged with base ingratitude.